fantastic. Guys, thanks for joining us live. This is recorded, so you can look back at it at a later stage. It'll be shared on our Facebook page, so you can go back and look over any information that you might have missed or would like to recap on. Obviously, we've got Taylor Ryan, the sports dietitian, with us tonight. Taylor sort of came into my site just through Rob and Jess, and I know she's worked very closely with Jess and really helped Jess a lot in the last 6 to 12 months. So, and then a lot of athletes always asking nutrition, and it's kind of not my thing, but I often refer them, well, I always refer them to Taylor and jump on and have a look. So you're welcome, Taylor. Thank you for taking the time to join us tonight. Really appreciate that.
Thank you for having me.
Able to introduce herself more and tell you a little bit about herself, and then go from there, guys.
Awesome. Thank you very much, guys. So I try and keep this nice and casual so you don't feel like it's going to be very formal, as I prefer it to be a little bit more chilled, as you get, I guess, the raw version of myself. So a little bit of background about myself. I don't really like talking about myself either. Is I'm accredited practicing sports dietitian with 5 years experience from, I guess, graduating to now, but I specifically work with strength and conditioning athletes from recreational to elite standards. So obviously the elite guys I deal with, Jess Coughlin, we've got Royce, we've got most of the Taurian guys that I look after, and even weightlifters as well. So I look after a few Olympic lifters who represent both the Com Games as well as the Olympics themselves. And then obviously powerlifting athletes too. So I guess my understanding of that strength and conditioning field is where my forte is. But then my own, I guess, background myself was I used to compete in Olympic lifting and a CrossFit coach of 5 to 7 years previously, so I guess I understand what CrossFit's about itself, but then also to the complexities that go with the sport itself. I do deal with everyday guys too, so not just looking after elite guys, like I said. So even some of my top guys like Dave Driscoll, for example, he's a great example of just general athlete who's eating for performance but is also for health as well. So I guess when I say that, what is considered an athlete in my eyes is anyone who wants to move. So that's why I say it's catered to all individuals, not specifically for that elite level by any means. So I guess tonight, what I want to mainly focus on is getting you guys have a good understanding about what nutrition is, not just from a performance perspective, but also what nutrition means for everyday living. So I know from, whatever age group we tend to, focus on, that a lot of individuals really want to pound in on their performance, but their daily nutrition, is taking the biggest hit. So most of the time, individuals aren't eating enough because particularly within the CrossFit scene, it tends to be very much associated with more of a lower carbohydrate or low, I guess, intake of food to support that performance aspect, where a lot of people want to focus on that aesthetic aspect. So I always say to individuals, weight loss and fat loss are two totally different things. So weight loss can apply to obviously, anything on the scales, losing weight overnight, those type of manipulations, to obviously fat loss being more focused on that body composition that we're trying to, get down to in terms of being leaner, fitter, faster. So without making it, too complicated when it comes to my CrossFit guys, whether you are that recreational to elite standard, it doesn't necessarily differ for us. We all have the same physiology, apart from obviously the differences between male and female. So as we understand what CrossFit's about, majority of it is focusing on, fueling yourself effectively for the work ahead, but making sure that you understand, I guess, a little bit about the energy systems and how our body works. So as you guys are aware, it's a high demand sport, which means that, you're not really ever working at a low intensity based heart rate, I would say. And it is relatively always between that medium to high intensity. So heart rate is always jacked when it comes to the CrossFit workouts that we participate in. That doesn't matter whether you're, coming into CrossFit not very fit or you're coming into CrossFit very fit. Obviously, that's going to differ based on your training age. However, the overall intensity of that workout is going to be very similar for everyone based on the, the systems that we utilize to get fitter, faster, stronger within CrossFit. So basically what I'm trying to say is our sport that we choose is highly demanding on carbohydrates as being the main fuel source if performance is your goal. Now I hear a lot of people say that, that is their goal and then the outcome isn't matching. So like I said at the start, majority of people tend to do more of a low carbohydrate approach for that aesthetic look, associated with CrossFit, because unfortunately we have this stigma in our mind that to be fit you need to have a six-pack, or to be fit you need to look a certain way, and vice versa. But I'm assuming now, as everyone can be aware, regardless of your age group that you participate in, the size and the athleticism of each individual varies significantly, and it's not necessarily defined about how lean you are within this sport, because that doesn't necessarily mean anything when it comes to getting your max clean and jerk or anything like that. Obviously, body composition does serve its purpose in terms of, obviously, if you have less fat and more muscle, it's going to be advantageous for producing a higher power output, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be essentially shredded to be where you're at, if that makes sense. Do people understand that a little bit? Yeah, so basically what I'm trying to get at with that is, when we're looking at someone's nutrition as a whole aspect, we never want our diet to be summed up in parts. We want it to look like as 100% approach. So we want to focus on eating, for our daily requirements. So what I mean by that is, obviously, good habits is what makes an athlete who they are, right? So when that comes to training, you guys can all, most of the time people always put their training first as a priority, which is, completely fine. It's easy for me to sit here saying nutrition should be more of a priority because I am a sports dietitian. But, people argue differently when it comes to training. Before I did dietetics, I always put training first and food was in the back end. So I am human as well. So I'm very much what you guys are like. But then as you start to educate yourself more, you start to realize that your nutrition is actually what fuels your session, and effectively your long-term goals. So as a result, we always want to start with good principles with our nutrition. So making sure that our food first approach, using those whole foods as much as possible, offering the best nourishment. So that's going to be great for not only your physical performance, but also it's going to be good for that whole, aspect that we're looking at. So physical, mental, emotional, the bigger picture of your nutrition, not just handing on that tunnel vision that we tend to have when it comes to people just seeing training and nutrition and that's it. But obviously they intertwine quite heavily. And also remember, you're far less likely to when you have a sound diet, that's the whole aspect, you're less likely to overeat on the shitty foods. I'm not saying you can't have any of those foods by any means, because all foods fit in a place within everyone's nutrition and dieting habits. But it just makes you understand that when you're focusing on good quality foods, it's harder to overeat capsicums, right? When you're looking at caramel koalas, you can easily smash caramel koalas, but do you reckon the equivalent to what they are in capsicums that you guys could eat a lot of? So it's getting people to understand nutrition quality as well as quantity is really important regardless of your age, particularly as we age too. Unfortunately, the aging process means that comes with that, is a higher risk of dropping muscle mass, decreased appetite is experienced, so therefore it's harder to get in our nutrition in adequate amounts. Our recovery isn't as good. I'm making aging sound amazing right now, and but what we want to focus on as a whole from there is that nutrition really should be the forefront of what our interventions are, because of the fact that our body just doesn't adapt as efficiently as what it did previously, if that makes sense. And I noticed that now from when I was like 20 to almost my 30s now, how much my body changes and how your body doesn't bounce back as effectively. So that's why your interventions need to be more on point and more fine-tuned. That tends to come from behavioralism opposed to following a meal plan or your macros or whatever it is, that dietary intervention that you're trying to do, because if dietary intervention doesn't come with behavioralism, you're not going to succeed, right? Because how easy is it when you start any intervention from a dietary perspective, whether that's a meal plan or macros, within the first couple of weeks, you're really motivated, correct? So you're like, oh, this is awesome. I can do this. It's quite feasible. And then life kicks in. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, I forgot that meal. I forgot to measure that. Oh, that was a pain in the butt. Oh, I've only got 5 grams of protein, 10 grams of fat, 3 grams of carbs left for my daily intake and my macros. What am I meant to eat, right? Because you start to realize that life then comes into play. So as you can see, I always say to people, to eat intelligently is so much more difficult to do. But if you're educated around how to, put those things into place, it makes it so much easier to see what your daily nutrition should look like to be feasible to whatever your goal might be. So I always say to people to eat is a necessity, but to eat intelligently is an art, right? Just like training, you know, you can train to be amazing at what you do, or you can train and overtrain, and as a result, you know, not get anywhere. So just like the programming that you do, there's always, you know, an end goal towards that. So you can either do that really in a difficult manner, or you can do it in a way that's sustainable. So that's what we always try and focus on when it comes to nutrition. And in saying that, also I'm a big advocate of trying to listen to what your body needs. So as a result, you know, we get this whole stigma associated with you can't eat these foods because these are bad foods. You can't eat these foods are better because they're classified as good. But define what's classified as good and bad, right? That's a stigma associated with the diet culture that's been around for years. And as you probably understand, you know, that from a master athlete perspective, it becomes more difficult because all of a sudden everyone's like, you need these supplements, you need these types of foods to help you, and all this. So you start to see a lot more noise in the nutrition space, particularly with our masters. Can anyone agree with that? Yeah, all you have to do is walk down to your local sup store and they try and sell you everything. Or, you know, immune boosting such foods that are, or, you know, supplements that are going on at the moment because of COVID. Don't get sucked into that sort of stuff because you definitely don't need it. Again, we go back to the overall goal that you're trying to focus on, which is making sure that your diet is adequate from a wholesome perspective, not from, you know, looking for the minor details. So I say to people, don't focus on the icing of the cake, which is what a lot of people tend to do, because that's this interesting stuff. You know, that's oh, here's your supplement XYZ. This is what you can do. Your training will be 10 times better if you take this. But we forget about the actual, you know, the batter of the cake, and that's the most important part. So, or another way of experiencing this is, have you ever seen that triangle that has, you know, your calories and your nutrition and everything, and then the supplements is the last thing at the top? Very similar situation in terms of that. So I guess that's why when it comes to your nutrition, is just focusing on overall that main goal that we're trying to achieve, and making sure when you sit back and you look at it, that how restrictive are you being? Is it going to be sustainable? Which is what I always say to people. It doesn't matter what diet you do, regardless of whether it's a fad diet. So if it's a keto diet, if it's a carnivore diet, whatever it is that you're doing, you need to sit back and ask yourself, is it feasible and is it sustainable for my long-term health and longevity? Because if it isn't, I can guarantee you'll fail within 4 to 6 weeks. And that's the problem, because what does that relate to, guys? Behavior change. So it's easy to kind of get into those fad dieting habits because, you know, they sound good. You know, everyone's doing. Anecdotal evidence is not evidence. Can I just repeat that again? So anecdotal evidence does not mean that it's evidence-based. So what anecdotal is what, you know, George, Fred, and Sharon said to you about the keto diet working, and that it's applicable and that you should really do it, opposed to actual science, which sometimes, you know, can take a little bit longer to get results for, because, you know, welcome to science and research. However, you know, that's where it's really important to work with someone who understands what they're trying to do, because every individual will be different. Just because it worked for Fred, Sharon, and Paul doesn't mean it's going to work for you and you're going to achieve the same results. And unfortunately, there is athletes from, you know, recreational to elite who are promoting things that shouldn't be promoted. And because they have an influencing status, that's enough for you to be like, I'm going to listen to XYZ opposed to an accredited sports dietitian, because they have higher influence in the social media realm, or, you know, just because their stigma and their status, that all of a sudden they become more of a priority. But can I please reiterate that an athlete is, you know, unless they're qualified within dietetics or nutrition or whatever they're trying to do, does not mean that they should be providing nutritional advice, because it can do more harm than good. And it's not necessarily going to be evidence-based. And again, that sustainability factor and the long-term effects of what happens can be more detrimental to your health, because you're following what your favorite top athlete said. Does that make sense? Yeah, and I can tell you now, most of you would have experienced that or have no examples of that. But it's always trying to find you know, what the motive is behind individuals most of the time with that sort of stuff. But it is also to understand that if you are following evidence-based guidelines, or you are working with someone, you know, and you come across those individuals, it's not necessarily that they're doing a wrong thing as per se, but it's easier to get advice within the right area to know as to whether you're actually wasting your time or your money, and vice versa. So I have a really bad habit of going on tangents because I can talk about anything pretty much all night. But what I wanted to then focus on moving forward within this realm, and particularly within the masters aspect, is making sure that during this time, particularly with the COVID situation, I always say to people, don't stress so much about your performance. We're in the middle of a pandemic. It's not like we've been locked down for the you know, shits and gigs. We've been locked down based on something that we have no control on. So from you know, if you said to me, Tay, what have you been doing most of the time with your athletes, whether they're recreational to elite, given this time period? And to me, to be honest, most of it is making sure that their mental health and how they perceive their goals is still relatively important to them, because performance can take a backseat. And I know you're probably like, but my training's really important. I'm like, I'm not saying that should ever take precedence or anything like that. But what I'm saying is, as humans, we go to the extremes, and we don't like to be able to adapt. And we can see that. So as you can see, lots of, you know, I guess companies, including, you know, MastersHQ, the Wildlife, all those guys have jumped on and offered, you know, free complimentary exercise regimes and all that type of thing to keep the spirits up. So that's what I'm trying to say from that perspective. It's amazing, but also please don't focus on, you know, if you've gained weight, who cares? If you've lost weight, who cares? If you've lost a little muscle, who cares? At the end of the day, everything can be, I guess, realigned and reshuffled to suit your goals. It just means we've taken a step back. And that's okay given this current climate. But it's also okay to be upset about that. Don't get me wrong. But it's also, you need to sit back and reflect and realize that at this point in time, nutrition is very important, but it may not necessarily be from as much of a performance perspective. We're using it from making sure our diet quality is great. The foods that we're choosing is great. The foods that we're ultimately consuming on a day-to-day basis will be supportive to our mental health. And that's what's probably the most important message I want to get to you guys from today's conversation, is that nutrition serves so much more purpose than just your macros and your calories. There's so much more to it than that. And if it was that easy, that, you know, my degree wouldn't be as difficult as what it is, unfortunately. So when I say that to you guys, it's more about, you know, what habits are you currently doing at the moment in COVID? Because are they conducive towards your goals? Because what we're doing now is what we then have to, you know, pay attention to or fix or, you know, get out of those habits when COVID is over and we're back to normality. So if you're a person, for example, and you are working from home, which is probably most of us, and all of a sudden you never really used to snack, but you find yourself walking to the fridge every couple of hours, just open up the fridge and just stare at it because you can, and all of a sudden you're over consuming calories. Now, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, because if you are hungry, then that's, you know, obviously serves its purpose. But can you see how you're now starting to create that habit? So it's a habit that you're like, okay, when I'm bored, the first thing I associate boredom with is food. So, you know, and that's okay within reason, but we need to sit back and address and really focus on, is it, you know, boredom, and all of a sudden you're associating that with food? Is there another way that we can kind of, you know, create boredom? Is get up and go for a walk or have a glass of water. Because what we do on a day-to-day basis, guys, our daily nutrition habits is what serves our long-term goals. We make on average, I think, 200 food choices a day. 200. Now, it can be as simple as, oh, Tay, I've decided to go from a long black coffee to an almond milk latte, or, you know, skim milk latte or whatever. And that in itself, that switch is like 5 calories to 120, right? You could do that 2 times a day. That's 240 calories, right? That's almost enough to kick someone out of their calorie deficit, you know. But it's important to understand that the nutrition habits that we're doing currently, it's so easy to mindlessly eat, which can see how your, you know, your goals of performance or weight loss or whatever it is that you're trying to achieve can be easily undone. And I know I said at the start, we're not focusing on, you know, you shouldn't necessarily be focusing on this pandemic about weight loss or anything like that, or weight gain, or, you know, putting on weight, or vice versa. But what I'm saying is how easy it is for those nutrition behaviors to creep in without you kind of paying attention to it, if that makes sense. So what ends up happening is our nutrition behaviors become are subconscious. So for example, you've had a crappy day at work, you come home from the work, you open the fridge, you eat a cookie. You've all of a sudden doing that habit without having a shitty day at work. So every time you're coming home, opening the fridge, eating a cookie, that now becomes a subconscious behavior. So to change something, regardless of whether it's a nutrition intervention, exercise intervention, rehab intervention, whatever it is, you need to make that a subconscious and make it conscious. Now that's really hard to do, right? Because if I all of a sudden said to you, you've got 5 things that we need to change because of what you've created within COVID, which is fine. Can you see how that can become quite difficult, and that no meal plan or macros is going to change that because it's associated with your habits that you've created with food? Do people understand that? Yeah. So as a result, that's why, the importance tends to come about focusing on what you're doing on a day-to-day basis that's promoting good nutrition habits, or maybe undoing those nutrition habits. And that's what we're focusing on, or I tend to see at the moment coming out of COVID, is that individuals are going to really struggle with that if they're not guided towards that. And then that then becomes a problem with your performance once you get back into training, lifting those weights, back into gym and all those other aspects, because you create these habits that may not be conducive to performance from a nutrition standpoint. So I guess that's what we want to focus on mostly, is that your whole nutrition is catered towards that end goal, regardless of what, pit stop we've had because of COVID. So hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. Now, I guess from there, has anyone got any questions so far before I ramble on about another topic?
Guys, if you've got a question, just pop your, or make a gesture and I'll be able to unmute you so you'll be able to ask your question. All good?
Okay, cool. Now, I guess a lot of, questions I get with clients, it doesn't matter, the age group either, is how much should I be eating for, I guess, performance with CrossFit, if I'm training, on relatively easy days, if I'm doing double days, or if I'm just doing longer sessions. And the answer to that is, how long is a piece of string? Because everything needs to be individualized, and that needs to take into account based on how much exercise you're doing in a weekly, a week aspect. So that's when we can kind of pay attention to how much you're doing, because the biggest problem, particularly that I see with, my masters group too, is that you guys all work a lot, you have families to feed, you're training on top of things, you guys, and that tends to be what you guys are focusing on. You're 9 times out of 10, your nutrition is going to take a back seat because it tends to be the last priority. Now, as a masters athlete, that becomes a problem. So for example, let's just say you had a busy day at work, you've got to come home and train for 2 hours because your sessions are really long. And as a result, you skipped afternoon tea because you didn't have time, you had meetings, you didn't get your pre-trainer in there, and all of a sudden you're training during that session. And the last time you ate was maybe 12 o'clock, right? So you start to do that for 3 or 4 days in a row because that's life, and those behavior changes aren't being addressed. But the problem is you run the risk of not consuming enough calories for your daily requirements, let alone your weekly requirements. Now, this becomes a concern because it's a terminology known as low energy availability. I don't know if any of you guys follow me on social media, but I'm a big advocate for this and getting people to understand what this means. So basically, a big fancy word saying that you're not consuming enough calories for the amount of work that you're doing on a day-to-day basis for your physiological needs, and then you're adding training on top of that. Okay, so as a result, you don't, because you're not consuming enough, your body kind of goes into a bit of a stress state, because it's like, well, you're not giving me enough food, you're doing all this training, I'm going to freak out, I'm going to put my handbrake on, my endocrine handbrake, which is what's associated with all your hormones. And, from a physiological perspective, this is when you can start to see concern. So for example, if you don't get bloods done to begin with, not saying that that's needed straight away, but I know obviously we have a range of master athletes here, but from a female perspective, that may mean you are going to, not having regular periods, your period may be gone. If you're at that menopausal aspect, is even harder to diagnose because you've already got that red flag system that's gone naturally with the declining age of your menstrual cycle being dissipated with being menopausal, or for males particularly, you may have low estrogen, low testosterone as a result, and you start to get fatigue. So there's heaps of signs that your body can do, and then obviously from a blood's perspective, your thyroids and all those types of things can take a hit. Now I know I'm explaining this in a very long-winded way, but the problem with that is the long-term effects of having low energy availability isn't just associated with your hormones. There's a significantly higher risk of osteoporosis and all those aspects associated with that, because the fact that you're just not consuming enough calories in this short period of time, but again, long-term consequences. So if you're a person who does this over time and you're like, oh, my trainings get affected, the training's the only thing, like the minimal thing that you should be worried about from the like physiological aspect that it can do towards your health and longevity. So, understanding that whatever those small meals that you miss, whether that's 300 calories a day, you times that by, 7 days a week or whatever it is that you're missing, that's almost 21 to 2,400 calories that you're missing across the week. So can you see how that becomes problematic? And then you're sitting here saying to me, I just don't understand why I'm not getting fitter, faster, stronger. And I don't have enough energy for what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis. And that's when we have that problem. So most of the time when people come see me, they're not eating enough anyway. So particularly for CrossFit, although I know you guys understand it's a really hard, demanding sport, and it puts a lot of strain in our body, which it does definitely. But if you're not then backing that up from a food perspective, you're pretty much just wasting your time, because your recovery and your gains that you're trying to initiate from training are basically going to be muted because you're not feeding yourself enough. So if you can stress from anything, the biggest thing is that the harder you train, the more fine-tuned your nutrition needs to be to support that. And also another concern too is if you're a person who naturally eats a lower carbohydrate diet, your body's not going to be able to respond to that as effectively because you haven't given it the, carbohydrates to support that. So think of it like for every carbohydrate we consume, our body needs a little nutrient transporter to get absorbed into our intestine. So think of it as like someone crossing the road, all right? You need to have a buddy to cross the road with. But if you are a low carbohydrate dieter, normally you don't have that little buddy to cross the road. Now that really sucks because it means your body's not going to be able to utilize carbohydrates as effectively. So when it comes to competition time, if you've been coming into a comp low carb and then you're doing a competition, you're always putting yourself at more harm and detrimental, because then you load yourself up with carbs and then you feel like shit, right? Because you're like, well, why this isn't working? Like carbohydrates are meant to be the bomb and blah blah blah, and then you get out of that comp, you're like, nah, I'm not doing carbs because they cause a lot of problems. I'm like, well, actually it's just because you've loaded yourself up with a lot of carbs, but what you were doing previously isn't effective to what your current outcome is. So as a result, you start to see concerns with that. So everything what you do to your body always has a backlash or a result of that. So it's really important that you like I said at the start, your goal and your outcome matches. So from a performance perspective, as your training gets harder, more carbohydrates or more calories are needed to support that training session. And then ultimately, if it's a medium training day, your nutrition can adapt for that again. And then it's a lower carbohydrate day, or rest day as per se, you still need to make sure that you are meeting your requirements to support your your goals. But at the same time, we also want to make sure that you're not pulling away too many carbohydrates, because then you're not going to recover. So I'll try and share this. I'm a bit more of a visual person. Now again, this is a plate description. I don't particularly really like plate descriptions, but it's very good visually for you to get a kind of an understanding without making it too complicated, because it's more, you don't want to give out too much individualized advice on social media, because people either take that as a grain of salt or they take it quite literally. And again, you can't really give advice to people over social media, because that would be doing you a disservice without knowing what your medical and nutritional backgrounds are. But I'm just going to try and screen share. I've already put one of these up on my social media, but it's just so you guys can get an understanding. You're going to see everything else in my folder, so I do apologize for that. But this guy, can you guys see this particular one if I open it up? This guy here? Are you seeing that? Like the huge plate description? Yeah. So basically, as you can see here, this is an easier way of seeing it, that as you train harder with CrossFit, you increase carbs should be going up to match your energy expenditure. So big fancy word for, you know, the amount of exercise that you're doing. And this will vary whether it's competition days or elite athletes or any individual who has multiple, you know, training sessions. So if any of you guys do raw strength and conditioning, anything like that, you guys would have, well, any training program, particularly raw, you have multiple training pieces throughout the day. So it's important to understand how we can facilitate that. So as you can see, the main components are our whole grains, so our carbohydrates, and then we've got our lean proteins, and then our vegetables, or our salads as per se, because it's really important to make sure that you are eating, you know, foods that contain a fair bit of antioxidants. Then the next one we have, can you see the moderate one that takes over? So as you can see, it changes a little bit in terms of your requirements. So your carbohydrates are still there, but ultimately they take a little bit of a back seat, and your vegetables kick in more. Your lean protein will always remain the same, because you should never change your protein requirements, because they're really important for maintaining your lean muscle mass. So, you know, basically from there, as you increase or decrease based on individual circumstances and the amount of calories that you need. So as you can see, the nutrition manipulation starts to be more associated with your carbohydrates, which makes sense, right? Because carbs are fuel. So if you're not fueling yourself as effectively, or you're not training as hard, then obviously they can be modified a little bit. And then the last one that we focus on is, you know, a light training session, where with them, as you can see, the main difference here is majority of our plate then becomes our vegetables and our salads, because those guys are pretty low in calories. They provide us with a lot of nutrients from a density perspective, which will then help with all your vitamins and minerals, and that, you know, general health and well-being. And as you can see, the carbohydrates will still be present. So it is really important that your carbohydrates throughout your day still need to be there, because we do require roughly about 100 grams for our brain to function. So if you pull that, you can start to see, and that's particularly prominent in low carbohydrate diets or keto diets, that you'll start to have cognitive issues, and that's not ideal in a sport that involves skills, is it? So, you know, particularly from a gymnastics perspective. So, and then as you can see, like I said, it's where we don't require a lot of high energy, so active rest days, and vice versa. And then again, our protein still remains the same there. So does that give people a little bit of a visual? I know it's very basic, but it's the easiest way from a visual perspective to understand. If you can walk away from anything, you know, whether it's in COVID. So for example, a lot of people have said to me during COVID, Taylor, do I still need to take my pre-training nutrition, because I'm not training as hard? And I always say to people, is your sound diet, you know, good? Is, have you achieved what we just discussed? If your training session isn't as hard, then maybe you don't need it. But if it's still there from an intensity perspective, then it's important to consider that, yes, you may need to still incorporate those foods to support your training. So can you see now, from when I suggested this at the start, it's how long's that piece of string factor? Because when it comes to nutrition interventions, the answer is always, it depends, because you've got to be able to have the science. It's all well and good to understand it, but then if you can't apply it to your own lifestyle from a practical point, then what's the point, right? So it's always about making sure that that is that consistency, and it is applicable to you, not Sharon, Fred, and George doing keto or whatever it is that you want to focus on with that. So I guess that then leads to me getting to understand a little bit about protein. So I'm hoping people know a little bit about protein here. If they don't, that's okay. Yep. So protein, particularly within any sport, but particularly CrossFit, is something that is always hammered on. It's probably the most, you know, important macronutrient that a lot of people will pay attention to. You know, evidence has suggested that you let more protein isn't necessarily better. So an example where people think it's important is they'll have, you know, 40 grams at breakfast, and they have a big hit at 60 grams at lunch, and then they go down to 10 grams for a snack, and they go up to 60 again for dinner. So as you can see, it kind of ends up creating this type of consistency. Evidence has shown it's more beneficial to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, big fancy words for putting on muscle or retaining your current lean mass, when your protein distribution is more even. So basically what that means is, if you're trying to, you know, saturate a pathway, which is that muscle protein synthesis pathway, so trying to put on muscle, but you know our body can really only absorb anywhere between that 20 to 40 mark, but you're overshooting every single time, it's suggesting that the evidence is saying that more isn't necessarily better. So what that means is you're actually consuming more protein, which means ultimately you're consuming more calories, right? So if you're trying to focus on, losing weight or focusing on leaning down, but you're eating a lot of this protein, obviously all protein gets absorbed. It doesn't just stop at 30 grams and say, see you later, I'm just going to pee you out in the urine. Your body will utilize all that protein, but evidence has suggested that roughly only 20 to 40 grams of protein will be utilized for muscle protein synthesis. Anything over that amount, your body will still absorb and utilize, but it's going to be things for like cellular health, cellular integrity, enzymatic processes, all the other things you guys don't or aren't aware of that protein does, because all we care about when it comes to protein is muscle. Right? So there's a lot more that protein does other than just that. But when it comes to even distribution throughout the day, if you can hit within that ball mark of 20 to 40 grams, that's going to be more conducive to maintaining your current lean mass. And then obviously, particularly when it comes to masters athletes, we need to be even more switched on with our protocols for our protein in and around our training and throughout the day, just because as we age, unfortunately, we run that risk of sarcopenia development, which is basically when we don't have as much muscle and we have more fatty tissue going on. And unfortunately, that's the aging process. So we want to try and make sure that our protein remains high, but within the evidence to support, the risk of not developing sarcopenia, which is really important. So that's why, and also too, if you have even distribution of protein from a weight loss perspective, or performance perspective for leaning down, protein makes you feel full, right? So that's advantageous. So it has a really high satiety factor. So if you're coupling that throughout the day with, your carbohydrates and your fats in and around that, you're more likely to be, I guess, even with your consumption of food. So you're less likely to over consume foods, opposed to if you're a person at morning tea who you just have a banana, right? Nothing wrong with fruit. But what does the fruit do to you? You eat it and then it goes like this, right? You just want to eat more because it's simple sugars. Our body can break it down really quickly. Another good example of this is white bread. I love white bread, but if I have a piece of white bread and I have nothing else with it, half the loaf's gone, right? Because it's pretty much, carbohydrates that can be broken down really effectively. So what I'm saying is when we're aiming to have that even distribution throughout the day of protein, making sure that our snacks aren't just carbohydrates. So pair a piece of fruit with some yogurt, or if you're going to have fruit, have it with boiled eggs, or if you're going to be having plant-based proteins, making sure, again, if anyone's here vegetarian or vegan, we want to make sure our quality of our protein is there, because unfortunately plant-based don't contain all the essential amino acids that we require, which we have to obtain through our diet. So when you're eating animal products, they tend to contain all those essential amino acids, which is the win-win in that situation, whereas the plant-based don't. So that's why you'll sometimes hear people pairing proteins together. So for example, rice and beans, that pair those two together and then make a quality protein that's a complete protein. But again, with the vegan or the vegetarian options, you got to be mindful that most of them contain carbohydrates and protein. So it becomes a little bit more complicated sticking within your energy budget. Not saying you can't do it by any means, because a great example of that is Jess, who I've worked with, who was predominantly meat-based prior, and then we tweaked things around for personal choices as well as what we wanted to do from a performance perspective, and she's mostly plant-based now, and you can see, I'm sure you guys have seen the physical changes she's adapted over time, but you have to be very nutritionally switched on or nutritionally literate to understand the effects of going vegetarian or vegan, because you don't want to become deficient in anything. So that's also another important thing to consider. So moving on from that is my thoughts on being more plant-based. I don't advocate anything that's not evidence-based. I'm very much, fence sitter. But in saying that, we should always try and incorporate more plant-based so we can. Please note, I'm not saying you need to be vegan or you need to be vegetarian. I'm just saying we need to increase our plants throughout our diet, because it is really important. There's been a lot of positive, research around that in regards to like longevity, gut health, fiber intake, all those types of things with more plant-based. I can guarantee you though, majority of the time that you don't eat enough vegetables and salad, because statistics have shown that Australians don't. And there's easy ways that you can increase your vegetable intake without really knowing. And one of my tricks, and probably you guys are probably all going to raise your eyebrows, but don't diss it until you try it, is when I eat my oats in the morning, I actually put shredded zucchini in it. Yeah, see all those looks in your faces right now? But zucchini doesn't taste like, now this is a really obscure version of like eating more plants, right? This is, you don't have to delve into doing this straight away. But it increases your volume, right? Zucchini doesn't really taste like much. So obviously you're still adding your peanut butter, you're still adding your honey, all those stuff that still tastes nice to oats, but there's ways that you can sneak it in. If you're going to be doing, frittatas, you can add heaps of vegetables in there. If you're going to be doing, if you do a spag bowl, why don't you switch the meat for, a plant-based version of it, not necessarily the the non meat-based substitutes, because they tend to be quite high in saturated fat, because obviously they're removing the meat products and they add in other foods to kind of make it last longer. But there is a particular product on the market, if you guys want to try it, and it's phenomenal. It's the Macro brand, and it's called textured modified protein, and it's basically dry soy nuggets, and it's phenomenal to make a healthier version of mince with less fat. And what I do is I just add vegetable stock to it, because obviously they're dried. If you just add water, it tastes like shit. Sorry for my French, but it doesn't taste very nice. Whereas if you add vegetable stock to it, obviously you got a little bit of flavor, and then you can make your own Mexican tacos or vice versa. As you can see, I'm going on a massive tangent here because we were talking about plant-based. Now I'm giving you guys recipes. But as you can see, it is really easy to try and increase your plant-based, and particularly from, them providing us vitamins and minerals, which is our antioxidants and pretty much our engine parts to our car, if you want to look at it like that as an analogy. So, a lot of us are really good at providing our fuel to our car, which is our carbohydrates and all that sort of stuff, but we forget about engine parts. So the last thing you want to be doing is a Ferrari trying to shove Toyota engine parts into a car. You'll still function, but it's not going to be as effective if you're a Ferrari with premium unleaded and proper Ferrari engine parts, if that makes sense. So who's learnt something so far? Yeah. And like I said, I can literally blabber on for a very long time. But, ultimately, your biggest focus, if I can, give you a bigger aspect of things, is that your nutrition should always kind of be considered like a jigsaw puzzle. So once you figure out one piece of the puzzle, there'll be another aspect that you've got to try and figure out. And that's just, not saying that to dampen your spirits by any means, but there's always going to be one step that you need to be better with. It's like when you do a rehab program for being injured. Once you get better at that first step, then you get another set of exercise to advance on that. And you keep going until you eventually obviously no longer have that injury. But sometimes we relapse, right? We go back to stage 1, go to stage 3 or 4 of that program, back to stage 2, and you keep going until you eventually learn those habits. So it's very similar with our nutrition. So it should be, because your nutrition should never be like this. There's no such thing as perfectionism with nutrition. So that's why you've got to understand that if you want to be a successful athlete, it's not just about having your nutrition on point from a performance perspective. It's having your nutrition on point from your daily requirements. So what you do for your job, life, all that sort of stuff. And then training nutrition comes into part, and having those two like working synergistically. Is that the word? Yeah. That you basically are going to be more successful athlete, because you're addressing, your behavior concerns, but then you're also relating that to training. And ultimately that's when you become a better athlete overall, and a well-rounded athlete, because you're addressing those, bigger problems to the situation. You're focusing more so on the cake batter opposed to the icing. And don't get me wrong, the icing is really important within reason, but it has its time and its place. And most of the time, it's once those behaviors are then addressed that you can then start looking at the finer details and whether it's important or not. So has that been conducive? Have people learned something, I hope?
Absolutely. Shayla, with the plates that you shared, and you had your bigger CrossFit days, and then medium, and then small, do you break them? Do you have the same size throughout the day? On a heavy day, you would have that throughout the day, or is that something, a bigger plate around your training session? Did you want to just chat about sort of how you break that down throughout the day?
Yeah, so obviously that's a very good question. So in regards to this, when you're adding in extra calories, there is no right or wrong. Again, that whole, to eat is a necessity, but to eat intelligently is an art. It would be more beneficial to have those extra calories in and around our training sessions to support adaptation that you're trying to create with this stimulus associated with training adaptation. So what I mean by that is, resistance training, we're trying to create a stronger training stimulus to send a message to our body to trigger the need to increase muscle mass or muscle tissue, for example. So if you're then kind of putting those foods or most of your carbohydrates at the start of the day because you're like, oh, I just want to have them there, and you got nothing around your training, then that's your goal and your outcome then isn't matching, if that makes sense. So most of the time, with that increase in calories, ultimately it's throughout across the day, but you mainly want it in and around your training sessions because that's when your body will utilize those carbohydrates more effectively. Again, your total calories and your total carbs are the most important aspect. So, but there's ways that you can break that down to be more effective for performance and training outcomes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. Has anyone else got any other questions? Yeah. Oh, how do we? Okay.
Can I unmute you all, guys?
Yeah.
No one's too noisy. Yeah, Amanda, you're good to go.
What would you most likely attribute like the 3 or 4 p.m. crash to?
As in you're experiencing overall?
Yeah. Every now and again, I'll be there at like late afternoon sort of thing. You think, oh, I am knackered, and then I can usually perk myself up a bit, sort of thing. But is that I've heard caffeine sometimes or not enough I don't know. What would you?
Yeah. So again, that's a good question. So majority of the time with this, it'll come down to a couple of things. Usually when I'm talking with clients, I always ask what their energy levels like throughout the day. So if you're experiencing that 3 p.m. crash, is it every day? Is it, a couple of times a day? What's your food intake like on that day? What do you do for a job? If you've got a physical job, anything like that that's going to create extra energy expenditure, that will obviously contribute to understanding whether you're under fueling. Majority of the time though, when you are experiencing those little lulls, it comes down to probably not consuming enough calories and probably not consuming enough carbohydrates effectively, particularly if you're then coming into like your afternoon training session and you're already hitting that slump. I always say to people, caffeine, there's nothing wrong with it. A lot of time people are like, oh, I've had a coffee and all of a sudden I perk myself up, because obviously that's the caffeine's purpose. It is alertness and increasing that, but you've also got to be mindful that I try and say to people, use what your body's giving you first before you go for external supplementation, and caffeine is a supplementation. So I would then be suggesting what your sleep like, what your energy levels like, what your daily food intake like, what your carbohydrate intake like in and around that, because there's so much more to it. Again, that's a tiny piece of the puzzle, and we've got to figure out how the rest of the puzzle is going to be created based on the fact of you're like, oh, Tay, I just hit a 3 p.m. slump. Do you know what I mean? So and it could also be training. Are you overtraining? That could also be another factor. So again, it's taking those, that one question and looking at it from a bigger aspect and then coming up with the outcome.
Yep. I also sometimes wake up 3 o'clock in the morning or whatever, starving, hungry. So, but I eat like nearly 3,000 calories a day and I weigh 80 kilos. So that's, I would have thought, a reasonable amount. But
yeah, because hang on, what did you say your weight was? Sorry, I'm just
80
doing math
kilos.
Calculation. 3,000 divided by 80. Yeah, so you're only roughly 37.5 kilograms per carbohydrate requirement. Sorry, that's a bit of a blind. But ideally, you should be on roughly about 40 grams per kilogram, if that makes sense, of carbs. So of calories. So overall, you should really be looking at I would be bumping that up to, obviously this is just advice, not general advice. I wouldn't, nothing to take too seriously, to around that 3,500. Because if you're already experiencing that, and if you're an individual who's a little bit leaner and being male within a higher demanding CrossFit, I would always try and add more calories and see how you go from there. What's the harm? You might gain a little bit, then you can just cut and try again. Do you know what I mean? So it's always about making sure, and particularly because your body's already showing you signs, like you're waking up hungry at 3 a.m. in the morning. That just doesn't happen normally. So if you're hungry, you want to have something to eat. And also too, if you're hungry that early in the morning, your sleep's going to be affected. I can guarantee you at 3 a.m., you're going to want lunch at like 10 a.m. Yeah, what I mean? So, yeah. So hopefully that answers a little bit of a question for you.
Yep, thank you.
all right. Anyone else or?
I'd like to ask. I'll take these guys off mute who have their off.
So is this B5's iPhone?
Yeah,
Really? Yeah.
Hi, my name's Brad. I was very interested in the plant-based model you were saying before, but my question now is about how do you go when you train at 5 a.m. in the morning? If you're saying, you know, you need to be considerate of your, I guess, your carbohydrate loading. Most of the time, I do that at fasted state, from the night before. So, is that detrimental?
So look, fasted cardio has had a real slam over the past couple of years. I'm not the biggest advocate, particularly within a CrossFit based sport, because of the fact that we need carbohydrates to be conducive of what we're trying to achieve. So when we go to bed, obviously we're fasting. Liver glycogen becomes our main source of energy, providing our body overnight, and then we wake up first thing in the morning, and then you've had no food in your stomach for 8 hours. Now it's not going to be amazing if your performance is your goal. I always suggest to individuals that we want to come into that session with some sort of fuel in our stomach. Evidence has suggested that if you're in a fasted and a calorie controlled deficit, they serve the same outcome in terms of weight loss. And I know that wasn't necessarily your question, but sometimes a lot of people do that because they think that fasted, cardio and all that sort of stuff is more effective for weight loss. But the research is showing different. But from a perspective in terms of nutrition intervention, that's when I suggest to a lot of people, we can incorporate liquid-based carbohydrates to have first thing in the morning. You do want to make sure you are still having some sort of protein as well, because protein and carbohydrates first thing in the morning, because you haven't had anything at night. Once you start to have that first thing in the morning, by the time you're finishing training, those amino acids are going to be obviously digested and start to, I guess, play effect in recovery. So most of the time, I do taste amazing is I just get, obviously with your pre-training nutrition, you want it to be fast digesting carbohydrates because it means that your body can absorb them quickly, is I'll get crunchy nut cereal, which is like the bomb if you haven't tried that. And then I will get protein powder with a bit of milk. It doesn't matter what milk it is, whatever you prefer, shake that up and then pour that over my cereal. So the reason why you can probably tolerate that first thing in the morning, it's low in fiber, it's low in fat, and it's easily digestible, so you're not going to have it compared to, which I would never suggest this, but a bowl of rice. Do you know what I mean? Like rice is still, a white rice particularly is still a carbohydrate that can be broken down quickly, but it's going to sit in your tummy. It's not going to be, the most amazing thing to eat first thing in the morning, because your palatability is something you also want to pay attention to. Sure.
Great. That's great. I think for me, it's more so the suitability of the time to train, So I have been doing that in a fasted state, but I'm not really getting my goal. So
and like I said, you can always trial and error with anything, right? So if you're like, oh, this hasn't been working, but I should try some, carbohydrate-based foods, or even like a piece of, another option is a piece of toast with almond butter and a little bit of honey, and then you can have a couple of tablespoons of Greek yogurt. Do you know what I mean? You're still getting that sort of aspect in there for that protein requirement, and it's easy to eat. Yeah. I would try it and see and give it a go. Remember, with any intervention, you need to give it time. So maybe trial it and then see how you go afterwards.
Okay, great.
Awesome. Anybody else have any questions you want to ask?
Yeah. Sorry, you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Taylor, I had a little question. It's a bit of a tangent. I've just noticed like the CrossFit space is saturated with precision nutrition coaches. Do you have you had many clients coming from that, like to then come see you? Because from just what I've seen of their, what do you call it, like their plate model and their resources, there tends to be a slant towards lower carb.
Yeah.
That personally worries me.
Yeah, so I don't necessarily like to, I guess, comment too much on other, areas within reason. There are a lot of people or individuals who are qualified and call themselves nutritionists as per se. But please remember, within Australia particularly, you guys can all call yourself a nutritionist, because there's no real it's not governed, it's not protected. So that's when you can really tell who, and I mean this in the nicest way, but individuals who are qualified and I guess nutritionist versus dietitian, because you can't just call yourself a dietitian without that qualification. Yeah. So, and that's why sometimes, you know, when you're looking at companies, they're kind of going, I'm not saying all of them, but they're, because there's many good ones out there, but they are going kind of what the trend is. And you got to also look at majority of those companies are targeting the Gen Pop association of those trends. So, you know, they're probably promoting lower carbs because that tends to be, you know, the easy way to get results within reason, because when you cut carbs, guys, what do you see on the scales? You see a shift in weight. But remember I spoke to at the start, weight loss and then fat loss. Yeah, is that difference? But I always say to people, whoever you go for nutrition, please do your research. Like I said, an athlete doesn't mean that they're qualified for nutrition advice. A nutritionist, unless they're university qualified, which I feel really sorry for, because you can be a nutritionally qualified, you know, university nutritionist compared to a nutritionist who's done a 6-week course. You know, and then compare that to a dietitian, you know, anywhere between 4 to 6 years of a degree. And anyone who posts testimonials, guys, they're allowed to, because they're not governed. So legally, dietitians are not allowed to do that. So if you see us, like, that's why we can't post any testimonies. I would never do a before and after of any of my clients, because that's a disservice and it's a false advertisement. Because if I'm saying, come to me, here's my before and after, and you get all enticed by that. But the problem is, you know, it's false advertising of what you can achieve. And all of a sudden you start thinking, well, I can look like that. And that can be detrimental, you know, to and giving you a disservice. So we can actually get heavily fined for that, interestingly. So hopefully that kind of helps you out a little bit there. In terms of not saying you can't go with a nutritionist by any means, that's not what I'm saying. But you just kind of start to understand who's a little bit more, you know, you can just start to decipher who you want to pay attention to, I guess. I think we might have had a bit of froze internet, I think. Maybe. Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, is everyone else okay? I think Ashwin's internet may have froze a little bit. Yeah. But has anyone else got any questions or? No. Oh, yeah. Yeah, Brad.
Thank you.
No,
Yeah, thanks. I was interested in that plate model. I have been going plant-based for the last 6 months or so.
Yeah.
And a lot of my food is based on maybe using a lot of dried pulses, you know, and vegetables into the meal. Having a bit of tofu and supplementation with plant-based protein powders as such, and really finding it difficult, you know, when you're looking at a higher calorie intake to reach those protein goals. But I saw in your plate model that didn't really change much, and there was more of the whole grain. So
yeah,
I'm trying not to have much gluten as well. So that's just a preference. But any other suggestions there how to increase the carbohydrates, you know, for those heavy workout periods?
Yeah, so I guess it's a little bit more of an individualized approach for that, but particularly to when you're focusing on more of a plant-based, I know you said you struggle also to a bit about hitting those protein requirements. That's why the evidence suggests roughly between, you know, 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight for your protein. So when you're incorporating that mostly predominantly with your plant-based, it may be a little bit difficult, but obviously you can reach that, providing that you're getting those plant-based combinations that are conducive to supporting lean muscle mass. So a particular amino acid we focus on is leucine. So sometimes it's really hard to get that leucine trigger, which needs to be between 3 to 4 grams per meal, which ends up being that 20 to 40 grams of total protein that we kind of look at. That's around about, you know, will provide that. So, you know, for example, that's like 600 mils of milk, and you're looking at around, I think from what I can remember, like about 4 cups of almonds. So you can start to see the problem there with energy density, and the fact that you're not just getting the protein, you're getting the like the fats and obviously some carbohydrates from almonds as well. So like you said, it can be a bit of that balancing act. But when it comes to those carbohydrates, you know, I find that most of the time on a veggie or a plant-based diet, it's really easy to get those carbs in. It's more problematic for the protein requirements, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I was just interested in saying that, you know, I'm looking at the beans and pulses as a protein component, but then I'd also have a carbohydrate component well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they'll have both. Yeah. So that's an advantageous aspect of, you know, the plant-based too, is the fact that they do have a lot of those, you know, legumes and lentils and all those come with the double whammy.
Yeah.
So which is good. And they also come with the fiber content too. So sometimes it's a bit about like that jigsaw puzzle, because if you have too much of them, not that they're bad, but then you might find your fiber intake kicks up quite a lot. And then all of a sudden you start to get a bit of GI distress from how much you're positioning that throughout the day.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. So hopefully that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. Awesome.
All right, guys. Anybody else? If you do have any questions or you'd like to chat with Taylor further, you can email her. I'll send you out an email address, or hit her up on Instagram. Give her a follow, because there's lots of really useful information that's posted quite regularly. So just follow along at home. You can have a chat and a consult with Taylor at any time if you just make an appointment with Taylor or her staff. So yeah, if that's all you guys have got, we will finish it up there.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. You have a good rest of your night. Thank you. All right. See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks very much.